Welcome to another episode of the Men of the House podcast, where we're over here exploring the unfiltered truths of fatherhood, self-care, mental health, and just navigating the chaos of everyday life. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Men of the House podcast. And today we have Ryan Gray with us, and he is an author and has a background in addiction and recovery. And we're going to get a little bit of background from him directly. He's going to give us a little bit of his story so we can see how where he is today, but also where he was and kind of how he got there. And hopefully this conversation will help illuminate or open other people's eyes to, regardless of where you are, as long as you get started, you can get to a place such as Ryan is at now. How are you doing today, Ryan?
I'm doing well. I appreciate you having me.
Well,
It's
thank you.
awesome to be here.
Thank you for
Yeah,
coming on this Sunday morning.
sure.
Let's get a little bit about your background and your story, kind of where you started and some of the events that led up to being the Ryan Gray that you are today.
Sure. I would usually say my using started in college back in 2004. That was when I started. I had not a heavy drinker at the time, but I started smoking weed when I was in college, and that was what led to doing some harder drugs, and also what led to my mental illness because I'm very severe schizophrenic to the point of being disabled. I collect disability check from Social Security every month because I'm disabled mentally. Marijuana kind of precipitated a psychotic break.
Now, did you ever go to psychiatrist or anything and have that schizophrenia diagnosis prior to this, or was it something you kind of didn't know? And like you said, when you started experimenting with weed and stuff, it kind of triggered that break that kind of led you to seek out something, eventually being diagnosed as schizophrenic, or did you not know at
Yeah,
all?
the I didn't know at all. Had a psychotic break that was caused by the smoking the weed, and had the very beginning of had a lot of treatment, but no, the diagnosis was not until after I started smoking. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was dual diagnosis, which is when someone is diagnosed for addiction and also mental illness together, as one can affect the other. In my case, I went downhill very quickly. The using, not so much the drinking, but the using led led to a very rapid downward spiral for
Now,
me.
what were you using besides the marijuana?
My drug of choice ended up being dextromethorphan, which is what they put in a cough syrup, like Robitussin.
Hmm.
If you ever heard of robotripping.
I have.
Yeah, that happened. That became my drug of choice because I would be in new areas, wouldn't know any drug dealers, and I would also be flat broke and couldn't afford drugs, even if I knew where to find them. So I would go to drugstores and steal it. Um, which is actually another side issue. Is it's become a problem with teenagers because it's so easy to get. All you have to do is walk into a franchise drugstore and put it in your pocket and walk out. But the drugs, started out that I was in college at the time, and I thought that the drugs were I was using them as an artist to stimulate my mind and be
Hmm.
creative and spontaneous. And it just kind of went from that to the point where I was doing them to escape and to feel good. At least when you first start using drugs, the drugs make you feel good, and that's why people do them in the first place. Later on down the road, the drugs become not so much to feel good, but to not feel sick.
Yeah,
Same
to kind of
thing.
maintain some sort of
Yeah,
normalcy. I
which is
kind of
which is a
quick
yeah.
question. Who told you about, how did you put two and two together that the Robitussin would make you trip? Was it your peers like in your class, or something you read, or how did you stumble upon that?
I think it was a friend of mine that I had, smoked a little bit of weed with, said he was sipping on it, sipping on the
Hmm.
Robitussin, and I'm like, well, why would you do that? And he just kind of just simply told me about it, But kind of like I was saying though, about the feeling sick is, you ask a heroin addict if they do heroin because it gets them high, and that's no, they do the heroin because they feel dope sick without it, and it's excruciating. That's a stigma. That's what that is, a stigma, because a lot of parents and friends don't understand addiction. They think that it's selfish and that the person is using to feel good, and that kind of thing. But really, it's not about, it's about what addiction is about: feeling so sick without drugs that you're in pain, and the only reason you're using is to deal with that pain, so you don't feel sick anymore. So it becomes not really about getting high or feeling good, but about not feeling sick, and that's the only reason that we do it.
Now, did you have any, I'm not as familiar, I'm more familiar with like alcohol, opiates,
Mhm.
some of those, but did um did the dextromethorphan, does it spawn some physical dependency, or was it more mental dependency?
I think it was both. It's been compared to PCP,
Okay.
uh, and it's considered a synthetic opiate. Just a little background on DXM. It was originally developed because they would have cough medications that had, most of them had codeine,
Mm-hmm.
and people were getting addicted to codeine because they were buying this cough medication. So they, in the lab, they designed this called a synthetic opiate, and a substitute, less addictive alternative to codeine. So it's not as, I don't know. I would say mostly mental. I would have, minor withdrawals if I went without it.
And what were those withdrawals like for the listener? Because I'm sure, some people listening here are definitely in the addiction space and or have had issues with substances. And so I've had people on who's had DOCs of like methamphetamine, alcohol especially, and kind of running into this being new. Um, I'm curious, and I'm sure the listeners are, what were some of those symptoms?
I don't. It was just a basic, bodily discomfort.
Hmm.
I don't know if I can describe or remember.
Maybe kind of feeling uneasy in
Yeah,
general,
yeah,
a little
anxious.
anxiety.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I've been clean. I've been clean for 16 years, so
awesome.
it's a long way back to remember that. But I don't think the physical withdrawal was as bad as some other drugs. Heroin withdrawal is notoriously terrible.
Kratom, because it acts binds to the opioid receptors.
You said kratom?
Hmm.
I haven't heard. I've heard of that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things that binds to opioid receptors, therefore it can give you that same kind of euphoric feeling as a pain medication. The gist of it is it's sold in, you can get it at any gas station, any smoke shop, so it's largely unregulated and kind of goes back to where you're going to find, young kids in those experimental ages that are
Right.
able to just go into a gas station. Now it is kind of behind the counter, so you probably do have to have an ID, so it's
Hmm.
not, it's not like you can just kind of snag one and throw it in your pocket. But, kind of like with your DOC at that time and this, that availability of, not having to have a plug or a supplier or something
Hmm.
really just makes the access to it much easier. But, the problem with that too is, I guess if you're an adult and you want to experiment, that's your prerogative. But when you start talking about young
Yeah.
children and teenagers, because, I have a 10-year-old daughter, and, that's the last thing I want is something that's available at a gas station. that she
Mm.
could potentially take. But yeah, so you're at what point in time were you like, hey, this is a problem and I need to seek treatment out of it? And did you know it was the drugs per se, or had you identified it as kind of a mental illness yet? Or was it like, hey, I got a problem with these. I notice my body and my brain aren't right when I take them and I need to go see somebody. Or did you go to like a treatment facility and in the treatment facility you got the dual diagnosis? Or how did that kind of come to fruition where you realized you had a problem, you took action on something, and what led to that dual diagnosis, figuring that out?
So I would say the hitting bottom,
Mm-hmm.
um, that that was when I actually started behaving differently than I had before. Um, that's unfortunately that's the tragic truth of addiction is that most of us have to hit bottom before there's any kind of change.
What did bottom look like for you?
That was I was essentially, I had been on and off the streets. I had some friends that let me, stay in their basement, and both the friends that I had that had let me stay on their couch or their basement were addicts themselves and were facing eviction. I was, sometimes I'll say when I'm sharing my story that the choice to get help is not so hard when you're rock bottom and you don't really have a choice. There is no choice, like, because in my case I was facing being homeless on a more full-time complete, like, the choice was between getting help and going to rehab and facing full-blown homelessness. So that made that choice a lot easier when I was facing full-blown homelessness. It was kind of like, there's no other option. And that was kind of when I started to admit that I had a problem. That was when I got clean back in 2007. So yeah, it was just being at the point of having my brother and my mom drive up from Baltimore to York, Pennsylvania, and picking me up and taking me to rehab, because it was between that and being homeless.
Now, was there a sense of relief kind of when you made that admission and made that decision? And also, um, did you get support from your family? I know they came and picked you up and took you, but picking you up and taking you to get help, how were they, in terms of emotional support and understanding?
Like I was saying about the stigma of addiction, people don't really understand. They think that it's this selfish act that, we're using or we're drinking to feel good, and it's a positive, and it's really so that we don't feel sick.
Right.
And the addiction itself is so overwhelming that it's like you can't stop kind of thing. And I don't think at that time my family had a good understanding of what I was going through. I think it's improved over the years. They are much more attuned now to the fact that hey, it's an illness, it's an allergy, it's a physical as well as mental allergy, that the physical side. So they don't, at the time, I would say there was not a lot of understanding of that. They thought that they would kind of bash their heads in, like, I don't know what the expression is, like, I think my dad used expression trying to help me was like hitting his head against the wall over and
Mhm.
over. Wouldn't say that they necessarily understood it, but they definitely tried. They were there trying to help me. Taking me to rehab was just one example. They got me into halfway houses, came to visit. Um, they tried to do everything they could in their power to help me, but I don't think that they fully understood the nature of addiction.
When you arrived to rehab, kind of what was that process like for anyone out there who's never been kind of a, you check in and then what was the daily? I mean, were there like groups, journaling? What kind of tools and modalities did they use to kind of help get you on your feet, moving in the right direction so you could kind of do this solo, but with supportive groups and whatnot?
Well, for me, in my case, I had mentioned the dual diagnosis. It was kind of decided after I was in rehab for 28 days.
Mm-hmm.
It was decided that I was too mentally ill to be capable of learning and, participating and being a part of the groups and doing all the things everyone else was doing, that I was too, withdrawn. I was too schizophrenic. After that 28 days, I was sent to a dual diagnosis actual ward. For me, I think rehab, the thing that helped me about rehab, even if I was not as perceptive, borderline catatonic, really, just not speaking. But I think that being there, I had there's a daily routine and a daily schedule, and you have to make it to it was a struggle, but by being there, I think I was kind of getting back in the habit of holding, you know,
Kind of
all
that
the
accountability and structure of a
exactly,
schedule
exactly, yeah,
that helped a lot.
yeah.
Normally, like I've seen through shows, normally they people detox and whatnot. What did they detox you? What was that process like? Because I mean, that drug, dextromethorphan, a little bit different than let's say somebody who's coming off heroin.
Mhm.
How did they do they give you like 3 or 4 days or a week while people are kind of detoxing, or are they still going through like attending meetings and certain things while they're detoxing, or how does that work?
I don't think that any of the times I went to rehab, I don't think I ever was actually detoxed from DXM. It's not as common as a drug of choice, but
Hmm.
there are people out there I've met people with that as a drug of choice and been told that there's actually a lot of people with that as a drug of choice. I don't think I had a actual a detox from it. I think it was
More the
just,
mental side?
yeah, that being unable to comprehend, like I said, kind of catatonic or just basically mute. I was taken from rehab to in a ambulance for whatever reason. I don't know why they not an emergency, but they drove me there in an ambulance. But it was a dual diagnosis ward, and I was there for 2.5 months, I think.
Well,
And at that point, I've had a lot of treatment, years of treatment to get back to where I was, before I started using. Well, I wouldn't even say that I'm back to where I was, but came a long way through a lot of treatment from the 2.5 months at the dual diagnosis ward. I stayed at they called it a healing farm.
hmm.
I was there for about 2 years, and I guess the idea is, they've got like horses and sheep that you shave the sheep and make wool, and landscape like gardening, all kinds of farm related activities that are supposed to be therapeutic.
Well, they get your body moving, and sometimes if you can change your biochemistry, you can change your mood a little bit. And so I think
Right.
probably that physical activity, and then of course being out in nature and stuff is probably very therapeutic. How did you feel about when you received the diagnosis? How did you feel about that? Because I know, like, some people, if they're diagnosed with something like schizophrenic or bipolar, they can get very, I don't want to say weirded out, but something happens to where now they feel like they're labeled as something. And sometimes the concern about that label maybe prevents them from actually, whether it's doing the work, seeking the treatment, taking the medication that's going to help. How did you deal with the diagnosis? Did it make sense to you? And were you like, okay, I accept this and now let's treat it so I can move forward and be the best version of myself.
Yeah, that's a very good question. You come across a lot of people they'll get a diagnosis and be prescribed medication, and then they won't want to take the medication. And one of the things that's something I say a lot is how important it is to take your medication. I actually, when I was on the street, I sold my medication. It was Seroquel, and I sold it for $2 a pill or something like that. And I think it's about acceptance. You're accepting that have that you have a mental illness. That in taking the medication for it, it's kind of like at the same time when you take the medication, you're also admitting that the you need the medication. That's a huge deal with mental illness, is if the person takes the medication. Like I said, I didn't take mine right away. I think it was probably started taking it at this healing farm that I was talking about, and finally started to take it. I think you said there like a label, especially like right now. There's also there's stigma about the mentally ill. Like I had a personally, when I had a psychotic break that I was mentioning, I had they had called my parents had called the police, and the police they treated me like a criminal. They put their knee in my back, yelled at me, and all this. And I know that nowadays the police, if you want to become a police officer, you have to take courses to deal with mentally ill people. People that are mentally ill commit crimes that because they're mentally ill, but they're handled for the crime part, not the mentally ill part, and they end up going to jail. And then when they get to
Hmm.
jail, the psych wards at the jail are full, so they end up in main population for doing things like like if I like threw a plate at you or something,
Hmm.
like that. If it was considered domestic violence as opposed to a psychotic break, and there's really right now this is a big issue about people with mental illness being um, taken to jail for something. So just what you were asking me about the label thing, yeah.
When you were mentioning something, it got me to thinking, and I know you kind of have your perspective, but maybe you can shed some light on, it seems to be a theme that people who receive like such a diagnosis don't want to take their medication. From yourself or anybody that you were like, let's say at the farm or any of these treatment centers with, what's a top reason that people don't want to take a medication that's gonna potentially make them feel better?
Because they don't want to admit that they need it. They want to think that they can go back to their old life and live the life of a healthy person. It's kind of a swept under the rug kind of thing. Well, not really swept under the rug, but it's like self-image, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You see yourself as being ugly, or being disabled. Nobody wants to be disabled. It's not a title that you want.
Right.
And I think if you're taking your medication, you're also in a way admitting that you need the medication. That's the best way I can
Yeah.
describe it. I didn't want to admit, I wanted to go back to my friends and keep using and live my life out. And I didn't want to have to deal with that. I didn't want to have to deal with the fact that for the rest of my life I was going to be have a crutch, so to
Well,
speak.
and I think too that, kind of like it's almost like in steps, like in order for people to seek help, they have to admit they have the problem.
Yeah.
And then they finally get the help. But then it's like if you add on a diagnosis such as yourself, then all of a sudden you realize it runs a little deeper and you need more help than you
Mhm.
thought. But,
Mhm.
kind of the way I picture it in my brain or I imagine it is that some people, they're probably like, well, I went to rehab, I did the program, I can go back out into society you know, this other diagnosis or something I got was due to the drug use. So if I
Hmm.
stop the drug use, that'll go away and I can go out and live normally. But even if they stay off the drugs, they're still going to have whether it's bipolar, schizophrenic episodes.
Yeah.
And when you have that episode, if you if you don't know and you're not equipped with the tools to deal with it, there's a chance that you're going to fall right back into whether it's old behaviors of using, or you're going to do something impulsive and, lift a bottle of Robitussin and end up back in jail. And that's kind of the way my brain kind of sees it. And so, kind of like you said, is I think once, not just admitting I have a problem, but then, kind of admitting and accepting, hey, I have this dual diagnosis. I'm now this. And in order, and I need the help and I should take the medicine to avoid future problems, because it wasn't just the drug. It's kind of like accepting that dual diagnosis is, hey, there's something in addition to, and quitting your drugs or drugs of choice is not enough to treat the mental illness because essentially your baseline's off and you're not gonna have a normal baseline just from quitting drugs like most people might. They even out eventually. So that's kind of what it made me think of. But what's been the hardest part of being mentally ill?
I think it's that it's every day.
Hmm.
It's not like even recently. I had a last November. I had to be hospitalized because I had a basically a nervous breakdown. So even today, 16 years clean, I still get hospitalized sometimes. So being hospitalized, that's very hard. I think the hardest thing is it being every single day. I don't really get a break from it. For a while, I was having anxiety attacks that were really daily. I think when the anxiety attacks started, I was having several a day, like 10 a day or something like
Oh,
that.
wow.
Yeah. And I've since gotten a lot better. Now it's kind of gone down to about once every few weeks. But yeah, just it being an everyday thing is that's got to be the hardest part. Not just that I'm having these symptoms. I hear voices, I hallucinate, to the point of being mentally disabled. That's how bad they are. But just having to wake up every day and deal with that every single day, knowing because there's no cure for some of these mental health, some of these mental illnesses. There's a lot of really great treatment out there, and there's new medicines. Like I used to be on Seroquel,
Hmm.
and I was put on, I was taken off Seroquel and put on clozapine, which has been the past several years I've been on clozapine. That's been incredibly helpful. If I don't have the clozapine, there was maybe about a year ago, there was one day where it was a Friday and I had forgot to pick up the clozapine at the pharmacy. The pharmacy was closed on Saturdays and Sundays. So I actually had to go to the ER to get a few days worth of clozapine because if I don't have a clozapine, I get manic, I get paranoid, I can't sleep, I'm pacing around, I'm but not in a good place without it. So it's literally an emergency needing that medication.
Oh, wow. Um, how what, since you wake up daily with this kind of and understanding that and how difficult it's going to be, like it makes me think of a never-ending marathon. And I've done two, and I can tell you it gets harder the closer you get to the end, but it takes a certain mindset because you can't see the finish line and there's
Hmm.
this unknown. So I can imagine that this is your entire life mindset to know that it's never going to end. So how how have you learned to accept, rationalize in your head so you can go out and try to be the best version of yourself and get the most out of your life. At what point in your journey did it click with you like, hey, I really got to accept this if I'm going to move forward and kind of treat it like I grew up with asthma. So I grew up as a young boy having to take medications because that's what was available back then when I was a kid. And so it was just kind of this acceptance factor of like, oh, this is something I do every day. I didn't really know any better.
Hmm.
But at what point, you know, in 16 years, there had to be some point you're like, okay, because I'm sure somewhere in there you try, maybe you get a little better and you think you could go off some, and then maybe you minus a medication or something, and you realize, oh, that wasn't a great idea, and then you go back on it. So there has to be a point of acceptance where you're like, okay, this is my life. I
Hmm.
accept it, and I'm going to do everything I can to move forward with it. Do you know about what point that was in your journey?
Well, there was a period of time I was at the healing farm for 2 years, and after that, I was in a group home for 4.5 years. In a group home, it's like a nursing home, but it's for mentally ill people. So everybody there had a very debilitating mental illness. I would say somewhere in that time frame, that 7 years, I think it was. I don't know if there was like a point, like a specific point or time. I think it was gradual.
Mhm.
Most of the changes that I've made in my life and the improvements that I've made have been, baby steps, just very gradual. So somewhere in those 6 or 7 years, I think is when that happened, and that's another thing that I say a lot is it even says in the sort of A literature that it's about willingness opening the door and not doing everything overnight. That's probably my most general basic advice to any listeners out there is you don't have to do it overnight. I mean, I've had maybe one doctor who disagreed with that, but I would say, like for example, when I went back to school, so I went back to school and got my bachelor's.
Mhm.
That was one of the things that I did after I got clean.
Hey, after you're done listening to this amazing podcast, be sure to give it a 5-star rating, then go check out the other podcasts in the Podcast Connection Network, including my own, Everything's Connected. Check us all out. The link will be in the episode's description.
I started by doing, one class, one semester. I was able to do that, so I did two classes. I was able to do that. I did three. And when I was did the three classes, I said, okay, this is the right amount of work for me. I can't, no more, no less.
Right.
So I finished out my college education doing three classes a semester. So it was very gradual.
Did you find that those classes, like having something to focus your attention on, do you feel like that really helped?
For sure, for sure. I was when I started taking classes, I was in the group home, and people don't really do much there. They just kind of drink coffee and smoke and watch TV, and that's about it. They don't really do anything. So I think giving me something to do, giving me a purpose. My book that I wrote, I actually wrote two books, a 2-volume work. And I was thinking I would read some excerpts from it later, but that also gave me purpose. So yeah, having something to do, like going back to school, become a mechanic or a chef or whatever, giving yourself something to do. Because with me, if I'm not doing anything, if I'm in bed all day, I just personally, I myself, I get depressed.
Yeah. Well, and I'm guessing too that, you know, not just, I mean, this applies kind of to everyone, but I think, in the context of our discussion, especially the road you've traveled, being able to take those classes and then complete them, showing yourself, kind of stacking small victories has to
Yeah,
really build that confidence and
for sure.
give you some momentum in the right direction. And I think that's
For
kind of a
sure.
positive thing for anyone, but especially, if you have a condition such as this, having your mind focused towards something and then showing yourself that you're capable of winning, and those little victories, those little wins for you can give you a little boost of self-confidence and self-esteem, and kind of reverse that whole what people probably in treatment and all these things, the people who go through these journeys, there's a lot of shame and a lot of other things around
Yeah.
their illness. And so it can kind of help offset that, I think, a bit. Did you write your books during school, or did you write them kind of after you finished your degree?
I started writing, I think I was a literature creative writing
Hmm.
major.
Okay.
So I was taking a workshop class. Creative writing majors do workshop classes where we write something and then the class critiques what we wrote. And I wrote a little small short story about being on the street, it being nonfiction. And one of the my fellow classmates said, you could write that short story, but tell the whole story and tell it frame by frame, like just the way that you've done so far. But they use that expression frame by frame. So one event to the next and telling the whole story. And I said, oh wow, that's really good advice. And took what I had written for the class and started to turn it into a full blown book. And I wrote a book that was 600 pages long, and I essentially split it into two volumes just to make it more manageable because it was so long.
How was that for you? Was it also, did it help you, like being cathartic in any way, getting it out?
Yeah, I mean, like, I go to support groups,
Hmm.
and so I think I'm and doing podcasts like this, you kind of get more experienced
Hmm.
with getting it out there. So I don't know that like if that was new to get it out there, but yeah, that's my preference has always been. I think it's for me, it's a lot simpler. Life is simpler and easier if I'm just open
Yeah.
about addiction and mental illness, not worrying who knows what and who I told this or where and whether they're going to tell somebody else,
Yeah, I agree.
And yeah,
It's about, if you can, if the one person who needs to hear this conversation or another message that either of us have participated in, then it kind of makes it worth it, you know, is
right.
is the way I see it. But then also, with having kids and whatnot, this is a place they can go back and explore a conversation, and
Hmm.
hopefully in a time of need, or hopefully it prevents them from maybe traveling the path that some of my
Yeah.
guests have traveled. I wanted to ask you, in terms of management, I know that kind of routine and structure play an important part in my life, but especially given your history and condition, what's your daily routine? What are some daily things you do that kind of help set you up for success to manage your mental illness? Do you go to bed at the same time? Do you exercise regularly? Do you have a certain set of things you do, or
Yeah, I go to the bed at the same time and I used to, I've actually made a lot of recent changes following because I mentioned a nervous breakdown back the end of last year.
Mhm.
And so, I was drinking like energy drink, two energy drinks every day. I took those out. I was drinking coffee all day. Now I drink 3 cups a day in the morning.
Right.
Go to bed earlier, like I said. I stopped taking, I was taking Vyvanse,
Mhm.
which is essentially like Adderall and that because I was all these stimulants. And so I stopped taking that. I switched from smoking to vaping not too long ago. So a whole lot of little changes recently, but yeah, going to bed at the same, I usually go to bed, take my meds, take my meds at 10 o'clock. Usually at my computer most hours of the day, staying out of bed because if I get in bed and watch TV or something, makes me depressed. Having a routine, yeah, like I started writing again. I started writing 2 hours every day.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you journal or anything like that in terms of for your self work and whatnot.
Journaling was actually what I started with when I was in college, but way back early college after high school. And I moved on from journaling to poetry and then started writing prose, started writing books. Yeah, the writing for sure, 2 hours a day of that. About what was your question about the writing?
Do you, well, I know that you write. you write a couple hours a day. Now, does that, if you don't journal anymore, since that's something you did before, is that writing kind of like taking the place of journaling in terms of like kind of connecting to yourself, getting your thoughts out? Because, like for me, I like to journal in the morning. Like I wake up and I might journal what I feel, possibly what's coming up for the day, how I feel about it, especially if I'm indecisive. If I got like four or five things to do and I don't know what order they're going to go in, I kind of, when I'm journaling, I write it out. And then I kind of go with when I'm done with one thing, what feels next, right? But journaling is a way that I connect to myself. But
Mm.
I'm also not a writer, and you're a writer. And with having two volumes, I guess my question is your 2 hours of writing, is it geared towards another book, a
Um,
memoir, or is it kind of like journaling? But I know that your two works are kind of about your life, which is similar to journaling. So is your writing the 2 hours a day? Is it stuff about yourself, another story? Is it more fiction related? What is that?
I was thinking I could read an excerpt
Yeah,
from the book.
yeah, go for it.
This is I think chapter 11. We were supposed to meet at the same tattoo parlor, the one right next to the meeting, our usual meeting spot. And she made me promise I would come. It was the first and only time we planned to do something beyond spend time in her garage or look at tattoo art, like an unofficial date. I took the bus to where we were meeting, an hour late. I saw her through the window waiting for me, but I did not get off. And I saw the look on her face as the bus drove past. When it hit her, I was not coming. I saw such pain and terror on her face, a lostness. She knew when she saw the doors closed that when I did not get off, that I was not coming. And she knew what it meant. Of course she did. I really hope to God she did know because I had stood her up. I was afraid I had broken her heart. I saw Lenore's face as I hid mine. It was a face of utter dejection, of heartbreak indescribable I knew I had caused, a face of loss like the faces of denizens after a town had been burned to the ground or swallowed up in a tidal wave, catastrophes carrying away all, even the ash and smoke of memories. Loss, tremendous loss, desperately clutched at in the biting cold. I saw on her face whatever crude, despairing, mortal pain preceded grief. And oh, words may contain little, for in their utter failure at the task, their practice and art proven at tremendous lacking, their work is not even enough to betray a semblance of what I saw. Her face, pale and flushed, was a beautiful but morose medley, an ode about an ocean with its bottom carved out by a dull rusted blade. Her eyes were downcast, tethered by the immense implicable weight of sorrow. Woman, oh woman. She seemed to be checking her phone in denial of the time of day, denial that I was coming, of what it was meant to be too late, when lateness was not lateness any longer, but signified absence, signified nothing. A period of time without me in it, where hope and jubilee were replaced by the knowledge that we would never be.
I like the how it reads the book, and then there was a couple pieces in there that you could almost see like a poetry-ish background in a
Yeah,
few of the lines.
like a lyricism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's good. Yeah, so I can, yeah, it definitely kind of connects back to you for sure. And you're working on other books in your writings?
Yeah. Right now, I'm written about 20 some pages of a fiction. This is nonfiction,
Hmm.
technically. But what I've been working on about the past month or two has been fiction, more of a novel.
Now, when you write for 2 hours, I've heard a lot of writers kind of say this or compare it to it's just a matter of sometimes putting in the reps, even if you scrap what you wrote,
Yeah,
you don't like or whatever after you go back, but it's really about getting the reps in. Do you find that to be true for you?
absolutely. Like, I think the best advice I can give for somebody who wants to write is to make it a habit. Back when I was writing Twilight in York, which I just read from, writing for like 5.5 hours a day.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm going back up, like I said, baby steps, increments. Pretty soon I'm going to do 2.5 hours a day. And then a couple weeks after that, I'll do 3 hours a day. But yeah, the getting in the reps was something for me recently was, I was complaining about not getting enough copies sold. And one of my friends said, well, that's not how you measure success. You measure success by doing the work. And even if, you're just sitting there, like sometimes I'll sit there and I'll stare at the screen for 30 minutes and not write anything. But I think, yeah, putting in the reps, if you can turn it into a habit, like 20 minutes a day, best thing you can do is try to make a habit out of it. Like what you're doing, you journal every morning or
Hmm.
almost every morning, and that's the idea. That's what.
Yeah, and I can tell when I miss. And then sometimes I'm
Yeah,
like, oh, I can't believe I missed yesterday. But, I think some with me, if I don't do it, sometimes I can feel a little bit disconnected. Like I haven't like my
hmm,
thoughts are everywhere because I haven't put them somewhere.
yeah, yeah,
That's one of the issues with having a overactive brain. I mean, sometimes it can be beneficial because you can think outside the box, you can think quickly,
right.
or in group meetings, you can come up with ideas in a brainstorm. But the other part of that is they'll run rampant, and some of those thoughts that don't need to be in there, if you don't get them out onto the paper, they're going to cross paths
Yeah.
with maybe some of your better thoughts that need to actually come out.
Mhm.
During this process, who's been your biggest supporters, but then also from your own personal point of view, um, who have been your biggest influences in this process of, both being clean, managing your dual diagnosis, as well as your collegiate journey and writing journey? Who were your supporters and who were your influences?
I would say my family, my brother, and my parents. I talk to them every Sunday. For a long time. A few years went by where I was using, and they didn't give up on me. They did. They had to cut me off. They had to cut me off financially, and was not allowed in our home. So that was hard, but they were still very supportive the whole way through. My mom would drive up to York, Pennsylvania from Baltimore, which I think is about a 2-hour drive, to check on me. And, I would get kicked out of halfway houses and they would help me find new halfway houses. They would come down, take me to rehab, all kinds of things. And like, those 2 years in the farm and the 5 years of the group home, they were there. It was the last two breakdowns that I had. They drove all the way up to Asheville from Baltimore. Asheville is in North Carolina.
Mhm.
It's about a 7, 8 hour drive. They drove down here just to be with me while I was suffering. With the books, I would say some of my biggest influences. I have a lot of sort of older influences, not a lot of recent influences. My favorite writer is Jack Kerouac. He wrote On the Road. His spontaneous prose. I like to kind of you mentioned some of the prose was poetic or lyrical. I think I kind of get that from him. I try to emulate his writing style, his spontaneity and stream of consciousness. I've been compared to William Burroughs. I think for the just brutal honesty of the addict lifestyle, talking about the addict lifestyle from the perspective of an addict. Been compared to George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, um, because it's about poverty and homelessness and unemployment, because when Orwell wrote that book, he was living in London and Paris when homelessness and unemployment were rampant. Like, you know, talking about looking for work all day and not finding anything and just being put out on the streets and being destitute and talking about what it's like to be homeless. Another influence was been compared to Charles Bukowski. He was an alcoholic. He has some nonfiction about just kind of living day by day with alcoholism, vagrancy, not really being able to hold a job, homelessness. The only other really, I think I've been compared to like somebody compared me to John Fonte, who I don't know that well. I
Yeah,
would
I've heard
say,
of all the other ones, but not this one.
yeah, John Fonte. William Kennedy is another one that I've been compared to. I compare it to Hunter S. Thompson a little bit.
Oh yeah, I like him.
Just the journalistic kind of spin.
Yeah, like a little bit of wildness with the truth.
Yeah, exactly.
How'd you get from York, Pennsylvania to North Carolina? Where was that in the process? What prompted that move?
I think my parents found it while I was in York, Pennsylvania. At one point my parents picked me up in York and drove me to North Carolina to try to convince me to go to this place. I turned it down. They drove me back to York and I was on the street again. And then I think I went from York to rehab and then from rehab to dual diagnosis ward.
Now, is that where the farm and whatnot are located?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so being able to go down there and now you've just kind of settled in there.
Hmm.
That's good though, because I mean North Carolina has some beach, it's got some mountains, so plenty
Yeah.
of nature. My sister-in-law is actually from North Carolina, but now lives in Texas.
Okay.
Yeah, the entire family. And it's funny because one of the guys we used to work with, from Texas, he and his wife just moved to North Carolina. So it's like everybody's flip-flopping between Texas and North Carolina.
Yeah, I've never been west of Colorado or east of the East Coast.
Yeah, we went to my wife and I went to San Francisco on our honeymoon in 2013 before it was super, super crazy, or maybe 2012. But it was kind of cool to be able to see the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, because it's
Mhm.
such a historic city, but it was also great for walking. You know, it's very walkable because it's not
Where where
huge.
was where
San
was this
Fran
again?
San
San
Francisco.
Francisco.
Yeah. So that was the only time I'd ever been to like California or anywhere like that. But I've spent quite a bit of time on the East Coast from my time in the Navy. A lot of time in Florida, most of my time in Florida. But yeah, kind of a two-parter was, there was a point at you realized you needed help. I want to ask you what kept you from getting help sooner, but then also I want to kind of ask you how you would tie that into my audience in speaking to if there's anybody out there who needs help. So it's kind of like at what point did you know you needed it? So they can
Mhm.
pick up on something within themselves of going, hey, maybe I need help. And then I want to know why you didn't seek it right away, but then also a piece of advice for the audience of somebody who might be seeking help, maybe something that will tell them to do it sooner than later.
I think it's the essentially just it's kind of what I was saying earlier about hitting bottom. It's just there's a sort of desperation.
And you know when you hit bottom, right? Because I've heard some people say, I thought I hit bottom and realized bottom had a basement.
Yeah, that it can get worse. It can always get worse. Yeah. That being one of the first things that you do is admit powerlessness and admit on unmanageability. I think that that desperation of being hitting bottom, that being destitute like that, not having anywhere else to turn. I think it's easier to, you give it a chance. You don't overnight admit that you're an addict, but you give it a chance. Maybe that will probably be good advice for people listening is you don't have to do it all at once. Maybe hit a meeting, see how that goes. For people that, I've worked in rehabs or in a rehab, I've worked in a rehab as a behavioral health tech. And one thing that I would say a lot is, keep doing what you're doing because, the main thing that happens is people they get out of rehab, they get a sponsor, they go to their meetings, do step work, and everything's fine, everything's great, and then they stop doing those things. And it's like when you stop doing all the things that you're doing to stay clean, that's when you usually relapse. But yeah, like I was saying earlier, that's the tragedy of addiction is that most people have to hit bottom.
Well, as we wrap this up, I wanted to ask where can people find you and people find your books?
Um, they have a website. It's called twilightinyork.com.
Which will be included in the link in the bio.
You can reach me by email, rgray, rgray, at alumni.unca.edu. And I have a Facebook page. The best way to buy the book is probably through Amazon.
Okay.
And the only thing I would ask is, if you read it and you like it, just tell your friends and
Leave a review.
leave a review.
I hear you. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because the idea is tell a friend, leave a review so we can spread the message. And, you know, like my part as a podcaster is to help tell other people's stories, to get them out there, to potentially help that one person who's going to need it or relate to it, and then potentially give them some resources or someone they can reach out to if they have a question or need help, even if it's something as simple as, dude, I don't even know where to start, you know? And so that's kind of the point of the podcast and getting your story out there. But all those links will be included in the show notes in the description of the podcast. So you're going to want to look there. But besides that, do you have any questions for me before we hop off?
I don't think so. Just you made me think of something. There's the SAMHSA, SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. That's a good resource. Another good resource is NAMI. We're kind of
Familiar with
talking
them?
about people spreading awareness about mental health and addressing some of the stigmas of mental health. And NAMI is all about that. It's all about spreading awareness about mental health. They have, NAMI walks and, anyways.
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with them. They would come in and leave flyers and brochures at the clinics I used to manage. So
Cool.
yeah, yeah. At one point, our administration was like, they didn't want third party advertiser solicitation type of thing. And I was just like, we were so far from the main hospital. I'm like, whatever, I'm leaving it here anyway. But it's, you know, it's medical, it's mental health. Just because it doesn't have our logo on it doesn't mean it shouldn't be promoted. Because there's people out there that need that brochure, need that contact, need a place to turn to, need just a starting point, and if a brochure and a phone number offers that starting point, then to somebody having a better grip on their life and being a better human, a better contributor to the world, then, with corporations, we can
Yeah.
keep stuff out of places for the dumbest, stupidest reasons. And all it does is hurt the people who actually need the help. So
Yeah.
kinda, it's something we need to change. But, well, look, I appreciate your time. Well, you've made it this far, which means you're probably a super fan of the show. That's amazing, and I really appreciate your support. To keep up with all the latest updates, make sure you're following the show on social media. You can find all the links in the bio. And if you've been enjoying the content, I'd be so grateful if you could take a minute and leave a review. It really helps us reach more people who might love the show as much as you do. Also, don't forget to tell one friend about the show as well. Word of mouth is the best way to help us grow. And if you're feeling extra generous, check out the link tree in the bio where you can find a link to donate. Every little bit helps me keep creating the content you love. Thanks for being an awesome superfan. I couldn't do it without you.
Let's go.